Oops. Hello, economic students. So in this video, we are looking at another question video. Hopefully these are helping. Thanks for your feedback in the comments. We're looking at exchange rates and how you can answer an exchange rate question. Now, just like we did with terms of trade, there are going to be questions that ask you what would cause an appreciation or a depreciation in the exchange rate, just like what would cause an improvement or a deterioration in the terms of trade. So you need to be careful. What's the question actually asking you? Now, if you were to get a cause question, it would look something like this. I'll give you another example at the end. But explain how something, some factor, some cause would impact the exchange rate. So in this question, it's open to you to make a determination about what would happen to the exchange rate. Another question that we'll do at the end might be like, what would lead to an appreciation? Or here's some data, what would lead to this? Same structure. So we're going to learn this structure and apply it to a range of different questions as we always did. But let's just remember that there are 5 factors, technically speaking, that you need to know that would impact the exchange rate. These are the factors that VCAR have given you. Demand for exports and imports. Now, of course, that's going to be impacted by overseas economic growth and a range of other things. Demand for imports. That's also going to be impacted by growth in Australia. Capital flows in or out. Pretty simple. That's just an umbrella term for money into Australia and money out of Australia. The tricky one is probably interest rates and relative interest rates. So the tricky part here is that if an interest rate overseas changes, well, that affects the relative interest rate in Australia and therefore demand and supply for Australian dollars. Terms of trade is also a little bit tricky. So an improvement or a deterioration in the terms of trade, how could that impact the exchange rate? Remember, there's a little rule there. And relative inflation, which basically is about our international competitiveness and therefore demand for our exports and demand for imports. So all pretty linked here. Once you know the factors and once you know the structure, you can answer any question about a cause of a movement in the exchange rate. So here is the marking guide. Here's the marking guide. Explain how X, so always we're going to do this as we've done in the other videos. We're going to demonstrate an understanding of the factor. So if the factor is relative interest rates, well, tell me what interest rates are and tell me what relative interest rates are, even better. If it's about the terms of trade, well, you'd want to be explaining what the terms of trade is and how it's measured. The second mark is for identifying how it would impact the market for foreign exchange. So remember that the price or the value of the Australian dollar is ultimately determined by demand and supply for Australian dollars in foreign exchange markets. So we've got to explain that. And the final mark is for bringing it all back together and just saying this would appreciate or depreciate the Australian dollar. And you probably should tell your teacher or me or the examiner what that means. So here is an answer that I wrote, which is right, but not very good. Now, the factor here, I'm just going to say you could have chosen the factor, or let's assume I put there an increase in economic growth. So the first mark is an increase in economic growth. Second mark, what does it do in foreign exchange markets? Will lead to an increase in demand for AUD. Good. And overall, this would appreciate the AUD. So I have done the full structure, but we can improve this. This is a 1 or 2. So pause it and see what you can add to each mark in your head. Make sure you do this to get the 3 marks. All right. So the first mark, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to, again, be specific. I'm going to say economic growth in our trading partners, because after all, that's what leads to increase in demand for our exports. If an economy grows and we don't trade with them, it doesn't affect us. Okay, so we've got to be specific. The second mark, again, I sort of stepped it out and said, well, there'll be an increase in demand for Australian dollars from foreign exchange markets. And the third mark, I just gave a little example of what an appreciation means. And I also just put in brackets that an appreciation means there's an increase in value. So all of these things are fleshing out your answers. They're not that much more, but they're going to be able to get you from a 2 to a 3 or a 1 to a 2 or whatever. But we can do more, can't we? We can do much more. Well, not much more, but we can do better. So what can we do? In the first mark here, again, the new bits are in red. I'm going to be very specific. And I'm going to say that actually when overseas economies grow, like China, they demand our stuff. And I'm going to show off here and say, well, you know, when China grows, they require our iron ore and our coal to make steel. I didn't say that. But they require iron ore and coal to make steel because when they grow, they build more and they need steel. The second mark, I'm going to say, well, if they're growing more and they're purchasing more iron ore and steel, yes, they demand more from foreign exchange markets, but I'm going to be very specific about how that happens. Well, they need to purchase more or exchange more Australian dollars in order to make the transaction, in order to purchase an increased volume of exports. Could have said iron ore there. So again, I'm just being explicit here. I'm not doing much more, but this is going to be impressive to your teacher or to the examiner. And then this last bit you don't need to do, but I've said overall this would appreciate. Actually, the dollar's depreciating at the moment. Definitely don't need to do that. But if you know it, you can get it in there. So overall, there is the answer. Much better than the one I started out with. We could probably do a bit more, but that's definitely a 3-mark answer for that exchange rate question. Now, what if you got to answer this question a different way, which is kind of what I did anyway, but they might have given you an open-ended question, like explain one factor that may have led to the trend. They might have given you some data, like the exchange rate appreciating or depreciating. So in this case, you get to choose the factor, but you've got to make sure that the factor matches the trend in the Australian dollar. Structure is going to be exactly the same though. So we demonstrate the factor, or understanding of the factor, how it would affect foreign exchange market, and then link it back to the trend or the overall impact. So we say, as seen on the graph, the dollar's been appreciating or depreciating. So once you learn that structure for answering exchange rate questions, I don't think there's any question I could ask you that would trip you up. You also need to learn your 5 factors, which are here. And I hope that helps. Bye for now.